Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here today. My name is Stephanie Drinka, and I am the co-founder and executive director of the Dallas Asian American Historical Society. I am joined by representatives from Asian Texans for Justice, the SAAVETX Education Fund, and other AAPI and BIPOC communities from North Texas. The horrific mass shooting on May 6th at Allen Premium Outlets Mall left 8 people dead and 7 wounded. 4 of those killed were of Asian descent, and the majority of wounded and slain victims were people of color. The killer's social media posts revealed violent neo-Nazi content that expressed hatred towards non-white people, particularly of Arab or Asian descent, and women. DPS North Texas Regional Director Hank Sibley made a public statement saying, "It looks like he targeted the location and not a specific group of people." The targeted location does not exclude the possibility of a hate crime. Allen and its adjacent cities of Plano, Frisco, and Carrollton are home to one of the largest Asian American populations outside of the coasts. The shooter lived here in Dallas, where a long history of racism and discriminatory policies have shaped the city and its people. We are demanding a full and thorough investigation by local and federal officials to determine if this was a racially motivated hate crime. Timely and accurate information from the Department of Public Safety and local law enforcement, and swift action on gun safety reform at all levels. With that, I will turn it over to Chanda Parbu.
Hi, my name is Chanda Parbu, and I'm the Executive Director and founder of SAAVETX Education Fund, the South Asian American Voter Empowerment Education Fund of Texas. Immigrants flock to Texas to pursue the American dream, seeking economic opportunities and a better life. Texas is perceived as offering a safe and secure place for families. The American dream was robbed of 8 people on Saturday. I want to start by acknowledging the tragic event that has befallen our community. The shooting that took place has affected all of us deeply, and my heart goes out to the victims and the families. And just on the heels of Mother's Day, we must take a moment to think about the mothers who were left without children after the mass shooting. Allen has become an attractive destination for many Asian families with good schools and safety as a priority. As of 2020, 20% of Allen residents were born outside of the United States. The recent shooting at the Allen Outlet Mall, which is a place frequented by families from diverse backgrounds and ethnicities, was an intentional attack that intensified our sense of vulnerability and a lack of safety. It took away one of our own. It is also important to acknowledge that almost all the victims were immigrants or communities of color. The shooter was a neo-Nazi. My community is frightened, knowing that someone with so much hate had targeted us and could do so much damage and harm. His social media showed references of his hate, particularly of Indian women. When I heard this, my world was shattered. Within 24 hours of the shooting, our schools in Collin County received threats of violence. Parents were faced with a difficult decision of whether or not to send their children to school. One high school student told me that they should be worrying about their finals and not worrying if they should live or die that day. This is not what children should have to endure. The emotional toll this has taken on our community cannot be overstated. While we had lost 8 lives, we must also add to that toll the thousands of people who have been traumatized by this. Children are having nightmares. Parents are having feeling of helplessness. Let me read you some of the comments that came in through our WhatsApp groups and some of our Facebook groups. Yes, we moved here in August from New York, but are now considering it's not worth it to live here. Very scared and traumatized mom here, did not send my kids to school. Same here, I couldn't sleep and didn't send the kids to school. I and my wife are seriously considering getting out of this country in the near future. This is a Texas problem. We are scared too. We also have a 5-year-old boy who is starting elementary in August, and he hasn't slept in 2 nights. Guns in the hands of hate won one that this particular week in Texas. Asians are the fastest growing minority population in Texas, and with that growth, we must rise to the occasion and stand against hate and current gun laws that have taken away so many innocent lives. We cannot sit in the shadows of discrimination any longer. We must defend the American dream. There are so many men and women in uniform who have fought and died to protect that dream. Our founding fathers created the Declaration of Independence that ensures that we have life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. 8 people were denied that privilege, and hundreds more will come if we remain silent. I urge you to take action. Stand against hate and discrimination. We must rally our elected officials to call this a hate crime, which has not happened yet. And we must make sure that they acknowledge that most of the victims were immigrants and people of color. We must rally to stop dangerous people from easily obtaining assault rifles who have continued to attack communities of color. Weapons of mass destruction and hate groups are a dangerous mix for Texas. We must support a full and thorough investigation by local and federal authorities. We will not let hate win in Texas. Texas will not be defined by this tragedy. Thank you.
My name is Amit Banerjee. I'm a native son of Collin County. I was raised in Frisco, Texas. I went to undergrad in Dallas County, and I now live and work all across the DFW area. And while my friend groups and my zip codes of residence and everything else about my life might have changed year after year after year, the thing that stayed constant was the disdain and the racism that I felt as an Asian American in Dallas-Fort Worth. To me, it was in my elementary schools, it was in my middle schools, in my high schools, in my colleges, and in my workplaces where I felt that I couldn't do certain things because of my race and my ethnicity, and that I was denied certain things because of my race and because of my ethnicity. And here in the city of Dallas, we have a lot of implicit and explicit examples of racism. And it is important for us to recognize that this is something that is cross-generational. This is something that my grandparents, when they come to visit our family from India, are experiencing when they're walking and just exploring Macy's or exploring a shopping complex. To them, they are looked at as other and looked at as different and looked at as someone that shouldn't be there. And that is a persona that comes from a persona that is driven by hate. And when we amplify and don't nip that persona in the bud, we are causing a community that is not where we can live. Additionally, when those personas are given means to act on the hate that they are driven by, we are no longer enabling a community where we can live. And so I call upon our elected officials, our community leaders, to really investigate into this and identify if this was a racially motivated attack, and determine if this was a hate crime, and if it was, how do we pursue this to the furthest extent of the law? Additionally, how do we remove those means from the next white supremacist that is going to act on their instinct and on their hateful beliefs? Because when there are assault weapons that are so readily accessible, it means that someone is ready to be assaulted. And my family knows what it's like to be assaulted because about 6 months ago, in Collin County, my mom and her friends went out to dinner. They were going as friends to celebrate friendship, to celebrate fellowship, celebrate love. At the end of that dinner, they were hanging out in a parking lot, just talking to each other, reminiscing about the good old times, looking back at what a wonderful life that they've lived together because they became friends in Collin County. A couple minutes later, they were attacked by a white woman who physically assaulted her and verbally attacked her. And that's something that my mom has to live with now. Assault is something that we have to deal with. Verbal abuse is something that we have to deal with. And there are very clear actions that we can take to mitigate this assault and this abuse that Asian Americans have to face day in and day out. And it is up to us as individuals to be upstanders when we see it or when we recognize it's starting to swell. And if we're community leaders that are decision makers, if we are stakeholders in the way that the city moves forward, and if we are elected officials who have the authority to legislate to stop what happened in Allen from happening again, it is on us to make those actions. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Caroline Kim, and I'm a Korean American citizen who has been living in Dallas for more than 40 years, my entire life. And my family is a small business owner family in Dallas. So I do want to thank everyone here, and for those of you who are watching and listening as well, because your support and your advocacy here are invaluable to our communities who are affected and hurting by yet another racially charged tragedy. It is almost exactly 1 year ago that the DFW Metroplex experienced another act of violence in Koreatown, which is a historic business district that houses a flourishing and hardworking community of small business owners and companies, including my own family's restaurant. There was a hesitation then to classify it as a hate crime, when it was eventually deemed so and the perpetrator eventually linked to other racially motivated shootings. And here we are today, with the suspect linked to violent racist extremism, and the majority of his victims people of color. It is so important, it is so vital, it is crucial to classify such crimes as hate crimes as quickly as possible, as soon as possible, as strongly as possible. Doing so mobilizes communities, law enforcement, and resources faster. Media responds faster and differently. And most important of all, our communities feel heard. We cannot just derive safety amongst ourselves over and over again. As your neighbors, as your friends, as your coworkers, colleagues, customers, as basic citizens of our cities, we deserve the ensurement of our safety, respect, and opportunities. In Allen, we lost 8 people, most of them people of color, because of hate. And now I wonder, how close was that to being me? The Allen outlet shooting was a place for weekend fun and leisure. It was not a place where there was any political or racially or motivation to be there, except just to have a good time. How close was that to being me? And worst of all, how close was that to being my 6-year-old? What happens, what changes when we say as quickly as possible that something, that a community is being targeted just for their race, is it changes the conversation quickly. And what it also does is hopefully ensure that other people who might have similar thoughts or ideations realize how quickly they will be shut down for even thinking or even considering another act, as small as a microaggression or verbal assault, as large as a national tragedy that we're here today, which is why we're here today. So we're all here today because of hate, but we need to leave here with love. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jerry Hawkins. You all are at the Dallas Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation offices. This is a space for community, so I hope that you all feel welcome, and particularly because this is a space for us to envision a more equitable community. Dallas Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation's mission is to create a radically inclusive Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex by addressing race and racism through the TRHT framework, which includes narrative change, relationship building, and equitable policies and practices. We do that work through a number of ways, but I would say this convening right here is one of the most important. The work of racial equity, racial healing, and racial justice cannot be done without all of us. That includes every racial and ethnic group working together. So I will first call on all of us in Dallas and Fort Worth, in North Texas, in Texas, to honor, number one, the long history of our communities working together to protect each other, to reach out to each other, and to provide a sense of mutual community and safety. We are who we have. Two, I will call on us to remember that we have an obligation, not only as human beings, but as people who believe in a future in Texas, to take care of one another. I also call on our elected officials. I was recently on a call with the White House about hate-fueled violence, and we are not having the same conversation here in North Texas. Right after that call, President Biden gave a speech on fascism. We are not having those same conversations here in North Texas. It is really important to understand not only the historical context of Texas as a state that began with the removal of American Indian, Native American, indigenous people, but as a state that admitted enslaved people when settlers came to this place. So it's really important to know that our historical context shows up today. Currently, right now, anyone in here or anyone out there, we are vulnerable to attacks. It's easier to get a gun than it is to get certain licenses to do work. So we are vulnerable, but that doesn't mean that we are powerless. We have the power to work together and to fight against injustice, to fight against racism, and to protect each other. So lastly, I call on our community members to speak up when you see acts of hatred, when you see racist rhetoric in your community, and when you see our community not acting as a beloved community, not taking care of each other. It is really important that we know that we have the power to do something different in this state, and we will. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Ramiro Luna. I am the co-founder and executive director of Somos Texas. I stand here in solidarity with my brothers and sisters as organizers and as advocates, and also sharing today in collective grief over another senseless mass shooting, marking the second deadliest mass shooting in U.S. this year. A community is once again torn by hatred weaponized with an AR-15 and ammunition, and the culprit was a racist neo-Nazi who should not have had those weapons at his disposal. Somos Texas denounces all forms of racism and discrimination at any corner that it may live. It hits especially hard whenever that corner is in your home and that member is one of your ethnic community. Although this individual was ruled by hatred, the arms that he was being able to use were given or were allowed by our elected officials that still have not taken action against being able to make it more difficult for community members to have weapons of this kind. AR-15 should not be in the hands of our community. This is the weapon that has been the weapon of choice for many of the mass shootings that have occurred in the United States. In a time where it seems that the right to bear arms trumps our right to freedom, security, and life, it's something that we must say enough is enough. It's been 10 years, over 10 years since Sandy Hook, whenever they used the same weapon. Just a recap of how much violence has been done through this, and by not yet making adjustments to the gun laws. 1 year ago, AR-15 was used at a school in Uvalde. Before that, it was used at a supermarket in Buffalo, New York. Before that, it was used at a church in Southern Springs. Before that, it was used in a casino in Las Vegas. Before that, it was used at a club in Orlando, Florida. And before that, it was in Sandy Hook. These are too many cases. These are too many lives. These are too many tears that we have shed. And I'm here to take action and to say enough is enough and encourage our elected officials at the state and federal level to take action once and for all. Their inaction will be seen as complacency to this violence. So action is required by our elected officials. Action is required by the police officers for a complete and swift investigation, and to call this for what it is, a hate crime. And so with that, I continue to stand here in solidarity with my brothers and sisters as we continue to fight for safety, the security, and the lives of our communities. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. My name is Lily Truro, and I am the Interim Executive Director of Asian Texans for Justice. We are a statewide nonprofit organization that connects Asian and Pacific Islander Texans to meaningful civic action to build personal and political power. Today, we are calling on local and statewide officials to do their jobs and to take action to protect the safety and welfare of Texans across the state, including the Asian American and Pacific Islander community. In a span of less than a year, the Department of Public Safety has once again made statements dismissing incidents of gun violence against the Asian community in North Texas as not being racially motivated. Just like in May of 2022, well before an investigation had been conducted, the DPS continues to make flippant comments without considering facts. Not only is this insulting to a community who is fearful for their safety, it is negligent and irresponsible. We demand that DPS and local law enforcement work with federal authorities to exhaust all measures to determine whether the shooting in Allen, Texas was a racially motivated act. The DPS has consistently shown their lack of regard to the personal safety of the AAPI community. Earlier this year, due to a lack of security protocols, DPS allowed for a criminal group to steal the driver's licenses of nearly 5,000 Asian Texans. The majority of these Texans were not notified by DPS that they were victims until months later. Many of them have reported that they have suffered financial consequences. This pattern of negligence is unacceptable, and we demand that Governor Greg Abbott conduct an investigation of DPS's actions and make appropriate changes to ensure that all Texans are being served by our state's government. We also ask that Governor Abbott take steps towards gun safety reform. In a 2022 poll that Asian Texans for Justice commissioned, we found that over 83% of AAPI Texans want to see gun safety legislation passed in our state. This current legislative session has failed to pass any meaningful legislation to protect Texans from senseless gun violence. And as the governor continues to pose the possibility of a special session, we ask that gun safety be added to his list of topics. As our state's highest elected leader, the responsibility to address mass shootings in Texas is on him, and the AAPI community expects him to take action. Violence against Asian communities continues throughout the country, and the AAPI community has made it loud and clear. We will not be silent as we lose more of our community to gun violence. We urge Governor Abbott and the members of the Texas legislature to stop their senseless attacks on people of Asian descent, like the racist land laws proposed this session, but rather to focus their priorities on issues that better serve Asian and Pacific Islander Texans and to keep all Texans safe.
Before we open the floor to questions, we just want to make sure that you are invited along with the community to a candlelight vigil this evening from 7 to 9 p.m. at Union Coffee in Dallas. And if there are any questions, we can field them.
Yeah. I'm Pablo with Bay Area. We've spoken previously. I just wanted to know, have you spoken or heard from any of the victims' families apart from what's been made publicly?
We have not. I know the Korean family has asked for privacy at this time, but Chanda.
We don't have any. Is Ashok here?
This is an Indian person's family is still in India, and they decided
Mhm. Any other questions?
Jamie Stingel with Associated Press. Have any law enforcement reached out to any of your groups, or have y'all heard from anyone?
They have not reached out to.
The DPS reached out to us briefly earlier this year regarding a driver's license incident, but regarding the Allen, Texas shooting, they have not. My experience has been the DPS has been very slow to communicate with our community. And so we welcome it, but no, we have not.
Hey there, I know the press release you all sent out says, demanding the DPS provide the public with more timely and accurate information. In addition to what you've already touched on, I wonder, are there any other questions or specific kind of pieces of information that you'd all like to know about that we have not heard yet from officials?
Do you want to talk about the press release? We've heard it. I'm sorry. The press release. The press release. So one question I think is more information about the wounded victims and their identities. Again, the majority seem to be from communities of color, which establish a pattern that might lead to a racially motivated crime.
Yeah, I'll add that the reason why we're asking for the identities of those injured to be released or as much information as possible is it allows organizations like ours to provide that direct support on the ground. So because the Allen Police Department and DPS were so slow to release information, the shooting happened on a Saturday, and we didn't start getting identities really until Monday morning, that prevented our group from being able to serve the community. And so that's our primary request for that. I will also say that the Allen Police Department have since put out statements. I believe they put out a statement on Friday that has just caused more confusion to the public. So really, we're asking for them to really focus on investigating the crime. They put out a statement around who was or wasn't the first to respond to the scene. There was a person who claimed to have responded to the scene early, and Allen decided that they needed to put out a statement about that. We're just asking for more timely information and more accurate information, and one of the things that we've found that we've gotten information quicker from national media than we have from the local law enforcement, which frankly is unacceptable for our local community.
I would love information on how they're responding to what the FBI has already considered a threat in North Texas, which is white nationalism. They have reported around like white nationalist gangs like the Boogaloos and others. I would love to hear the response, not only from DPS, but from local municipalities about how they're responding and going to protect their citizens from this, what Joe Biden just this weekend announced as the greatest domestic threat in the United States.
Speaking to that, Stephanie, can you tell us more about this local history of racism in North Texas, especially against the AAPI community? Can you kind of tell us a little bit more in context and the patterns?
Racism against Asian Americans in Dallas-Fort Worth has existed as long as Asian Americans have existed in Dallas-Fort Worth. The earliest Chinese immigrants in the 1880s experienced anti-Asian racism even from some of our media outlets, describing Chinese laundromats as contracting vile diseases, language that we saw echoed again in times of COVID and the pandemic, and phrases like China virus and Kung flu. Japanese Americans faced incarceration and loss to their businesses during World War II. And one thing I would add, an example during World War II of a Japanese American business owner who was about to lose access to his business. The community in Dallas rallied around and signed a petition saying that he was a good Dallas citizen and he was allowed to continue operating. So that also speaks to the amount of community care and solidarity that communities of color in Dallas-Fort Worth have provided each other when the government has ignored them.
I mean, Stephanie said it, but again, just to give some more statistics, there was an article just last year that said that North Texas has produced 80% of the white nationalist propaganda in the United States. Again, the El Paso shooter came from North Texas. The alt-right movement started here in Dallas, Texas. We have a huge, huge problem here that is going virtually ignored by our elected officials, our organizations, even our funders who should be supporting these great organizations here to do this work. So we could talk more about that.
Can you speak to just how frustrating it is that DPS is moving so slowly, they're not as forthcoming, when it seems like a lot of evidence, especially as you mentioned, coming out of national news, is pointing to his activities? It's like the dots are there, but it's just not being said, the line is not being crossed. How frustrating is that?
So the significance of hate crime legislation is that when crimes like this are committed to send a message to all communities, all members of a community, the message from law enforcement and from prosecutors has to be just as strong in order to make that community feel safe. So without efforts to determine whether or not this was a racially motivated crime, it's leaving communities feeling more vulnerable. It is leaving the door open for other people who would commit certain crimes like this to think that they have the leeway to do so.
Well, no, not about you. Sorry, I just had another comment. Going back to, other examples of maybe racism or in our community, I think other insidious ways that we see racist acts are the hesitation and the complacency in stating something like a crime as being a hate crime, or slow to action, or lack of action. So even if we're not seeing as wide a, something in like Japanese internment camps, we're still seeing that kind of rhetoric in smaller ways, in everyday ways, where you're hesitant to come out and say something in support of communities of color or in defense of communities of color. And I think that's another way to continue letting extremists and racist and violent people in our communities to continue and to keep growing that way, because if we're not talking about it or loudly condemning them quickly, then that allows them to continue growing that way.
Going back to the Koreatown shooting at Hair World Salon last year, Dallas Police Chief Eddie Garcia right away said that he did not believe that the shooter was motivated by bias. Meanwhile, the shooter was still at large, and so communities were still at risk. Asian American communities, Korean American communities were not on alert that somebody was at large that was targeting their community, and that is some of the vulnerabilities that happen when crimes are not investigated properly.
I know that you're all here, on behalf of your organizations in more of an official capacity, but of course you're all, members of our community. And I just wonder on a personal level, if any of you have children, how you've navigated talking about this.
My children.
Sorry.
Yeah, my children are older. So my children are older, but the South Asian American Voter Empowerment Group, we have leads in every city. And so in Collin County, I read you some of those statements, and those statements are coming directly from our people who have young children and are really having a hard time with it. The other thing I kind of wanted to say just regarding sort of hate crimes is our community has been enduring it. I've been in Texas for 45 years, and the first form of hate crime that I had against me was when they thought I was Iranian, and the Iranian crisis was going on. They were saying I needed to go back where I came from. I'm not Iranian, but that's the type of if we're brown, then we're going to be on the firing lines. And so it has been an ongoing issue. It happened during 9/11. So there is a history in our community, and I think the one thing that we as Asians have come to understand, or my organization has come to understand, is that there were very few resources 44 years ago for our community, and so we often just looked down. We didn't want to cause a noise. We just wanted to survive, and so we didn't report it. So there are probably a lot more hate crimes than what we're looking at, because we tend not to say anything about it. And even for the situation with the children right now, We're still trying as a community to figure out how to be supportive of the community, but children are scared. Namrata, you want to just raise your hand? You have a young child. She is one of our members from Allen, Texas, but I remember her telling me this week that her child does not want to drive past the mall, and they've got to drive past the mall in order to get to school. So there's definitely a lot of hurt in our community, and it's been we've had a really hard time navigating it.
I'm just going to add to that. So I live next to the mall, and my 7-year-old does not want me to drive on that road, and that is the exit for us to get on the expressway. Both my kids, a 10-year-old and my 7-year-old, we've had to talk because for 4 hours we had helicopters just circling our house. There were rumors of a second shooter. There were lockdowns for Manhattan. So we've been talking to our children every day. They've been going through the school counselor also. It's going to be a process. And I can say that for everybody in those neighborhoods that's around the mall, it's been like this. One of my friends, 12-year-old, did not go to school for 3 days because she just could not step outside the house. So it's been very traumatizing for all of us who are living in that area right now. Probably 10 and 7.
So if the shooting is identified as a racial motivated hate, what can be the next step for you guys or others to protect the equity or the safety in our society?
So the reality is, hate crime legislation to prosecute hate crimes in the U.S., it's a very high bar. So of all the incidents that have occurred of violence targeting Asian Americans, very few of them are actually designated as a hate crime. So it is important that every time we can conduct a thorough investigation to designate a crime as being a hate crime, it empowers law enforcement, to recognize when it happens. It also trains local law enforcement and prosecutors to understand how to tackle it when it happens. It also brings awareness to the community. You know, despite the number of headlines in our country around anti-Asian violence and hate in the last 2 to 3 years, it is appalling how many people in our community do not understand and recognize that violence and racism occurs to AAPIs all across the country, here in Texas, every day. So that is a baseline. But obviously, further than that, we need change. And like I mentioned earlier, the AAPI community has said resoundingly they want to see gun safety legislation. They want gun reform in our state. They want to feel safe. And you've just heard testimony from parents, you've heard testimony from community members that they are scared to leave the house. We've heard in the last week and a half that there are community members who want to come out and host vigils and host community gatherings to mourn together, and they're scared to do that. Our community is scared to be together amongst one another. So designating it a hate crime, doing a thorough investigation is the lowest bar of what can be done. There's so much more our local, state, and federal leaders need to do to protect AAPIs, not just here in North Texas, not just in Texas as a state, but across the entire country.
One thing that has been made very clear in light of the Allen shooting is how under-resourced and underrepresented Asian American and Pacific Islanders are in North Texas. For example, when we were trying to find a location to host our community vigil, we realized that we don't have an Asian American designated space in the city. We don't have a cultural center like the Latino Cultural Center or the South Dallas Cultural Center. We don't have a space to go to access mental health resources or to do the community outreach that is needed to heal from events like this. So my hope is that this has shone a light on the under-resourced and underrepresentation of Asian Americans, and the city and our community make some changes to fix that.
Also, Communities Foundation of Texas has several resources on their website. It's communitiesfoundationoftexas.org, and then Support for Allen, that gives many links not only for help for the victims and for families
but also for mental health and just for citizens as well. So I think they're a really great resource, and they've put a lot together for that.
Show up for the vigil tonight. That's a great way to support our community.
And at tonight's vigil, we will have a special guest speaker from the White House, Erica Moritsugu, who is the senior advisor for the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander.
Lizzie, can you get up there and speak about, what was your reaction when you heard the DPS say that this was not racially motivated, it was not a hate crime?
I think he wants more angry sound bites from me. So I didn't, full transparency, I didn't watch the press conference. But as soon as the DPS finished that press conference, I received a number of phone calls and text messages. So I want to reiterate that the statements that he made were outrageous to many people in the community. And it's outrageous because clearly a full and thorough investigation had not been conducted. But it's also outrageous because, like I mentioned earlier, this is a string of repeated actions. This has now become a pattern of the Department of Public Safety not taking the seriousness of AAPI safety in Texas as a real concern. They showed this, like was just said earlier, a year ago in May of 2022, before the shooter was apprehended. They dismissed as potential hate crime, the local law enforcement did. And then with the driver's license issue earlier this year, the DPS was very slow to respond. And even after I had a conversation with Department of Public Safety, they were very slow to provide resources in language to the AAPI community in a way that was meaningful. So we do see this as a pattern of negligence, and we do expect and demand answers from the governor's office. The DPS is here to protect all Texans. They are not here to pick and choose whose lives are worthy or whose concerns are valid. They are here to protect all of us. And so we will continue to demand the Department of Public Safety take that responsibility seriously.
His statement.
This is, I guess, for friends, relatives, coworkers. If they experience a hate crime, incident, where can they go? I mean, I know law enforcement probably could be an obvious answer, but what other resources?
Asian Texans for Justice has a resources page where you can report to the FBI, I believe. StopAAPIHate.org does as well.
I think the hesitancy of us to answer that question goes to show that there are very few resources for people who are victims of hate and violence, or even just what people would call, small incidents of catcalling, name calling. That happens to our community all the time, and those things have real consequences. It prevents people from wanting to leave the home, from going to school, from going to work, from living their normal lives. So I would take this opportunity to really call on city officials to develop databases, to develop resources, to collect this data. Even if we're not naming these incidents as hate crimes, if we're not collecting incidents of racism, incidents of discrimination, then we as a community can never genuinely address it.
As I mentioned earlier, our community is very hesitant for coming out in public and having to say anything. They're very much afraid. And so it's organizations like ours, which is the South Asian American Voter Empowerment Group. We do have community networks where we are trying to empower our community to be stronger and to let them know that there are resources and people around them who support them. And I think they're more likely to come. 44 years when we landed here, if something happened to us, we didn't have a support system. We didn't have a large number of people, but Asians are the fastest growing minority population in Texas, and I think an opportunity like this for us to come together is to support each other and let each other know that we are going to be supported. So this is one of the steps that we're taking to help our community heal.
I have something to say too. Also, going back to the Koreatown shooting last year, I will say that following that, and once it was deemed a hate crime, Chief Garcia did meet with several members of the Korean community and did a walkabout through the streets and met with several business owners. And one of his updated policies was to put a neighborhood police officer, an NPO, a Korean-speaking or multilingual police officer, to regularly
go to the businesses, and he also personally handed out his direct line and business cards to the businesses, so that if they can report something directly, they can do it directly to the chief's office instead of calling 911, which was one of several complaints that he had heard, was that they kind of went through the system if they were trying to report something and it kind of didn't go anywhere. That did, I think, elevate the level of trust, and I think that's something that we hope to see in Alan as well.
Just going back to the DPS statement, one of the issues with that statement about him targeting location is that it shows a fundamental lack of understanding of how systemic racism works and how it is embedded in every system and every place, and you can't separate location from the people who live there and what Alan is known for as being diverse, as being an area where there's a large Asian American and South Asian American population. And so I hope that the people that are investigating this understand how bias works at every level.
I just really want to talk about healing. As you all know, in 2016, after the police shooting, which was one of the impetus for Dallas Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation, every living president descended on this city. And their focus was not healing for the city. Their focus was the healing after police officers were killed. And I really want to say that because I experienced it. Every tree was surrounded by a blue ribbon. After this incident, we should be supporting and centering our Asian American Pacific Islander community. And I'm saying we should do that for every community that is infected or impacted by trauma, particularly from racial violence, because it happens more often than not. Healing is not a one-shot deal. It is a process. Racial healing is the process for all of us as people who are racialized. And everyone in here is racialized. Everyone out there is racialized to come to wholeness. And we come to wholeness by being in relationship with one another. So it is really important to see this solidarity moment, but we need to do this as a practice for all of our communities. So I hope that when you all see something else happen, because it will happen. There are more guns than people in Texas, right? Texas is the hardest state to vote in, and we also have one of the worst voter, apathetic voting blocks in North Texas. So it's going to be very difficult and an uphill climb to change some of these laws, but we can. So I invite you all to meet someone, particularly at this vigil, who you don't know, who looks different than you. That's the way we become in relationship with each other and start the process of racial healing.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you so much for being here. So yours,